Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Smooth Brain Society. Just a couple of notes before we begin this episode. So, the episode's with Dr. Pantea Javidan of Stanford University, and it focuses on the human rights of children and covers topics such as child sex trafficking and sexual assault, as well as trauma. So this is just a little bit of a warning. Another thing which we need to note is we recorded this episode on the 30th of July, but since then there have been a few additions we've needed to make, and those will be marked out clearly in the video version. In the audio version, you should be able to tell it based on sort of the change in the audio as those are recorded in post. Also, there have been a few news stories which have come out since the episode was recorded, which are directly relevant, according to Dr. Javidan. And while these news stories come from the United States of America, the episode will show how these can impact the global nature of laws relating to violence against children and women, among other abuses of human rights. So the first thing is on the 5th of August, 2025, President Trump has called on Washington, D.C. to begin charging minors for violent crimes starting from the age of 14. U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro has also come out in support of this and in support of lowering the age of criminal responsibility to 14. A key thing to note is this is for Washington, D.C., but it is quite easy to expand these laws nationwide and for other purposes. The latter part is very important because age of consent could potentially be next. So a lawyer, Alan Dershowitz, who was involved in the Jeffrey Epstein trial, has advocated to expand or lower the age of consent to 14 as well, which could absolve some of the offenders involved in the Epstein trial. The next thing to note is on the 13th of August, reports have shown that the US State Department has omitted evidence of human rights abuses against women, children, ethnic and racial minorities, and LGBTQ populations in countries whose leaders are aligned with Donald Trump. So two of the biggest examples of this are the report on Israel has been reduced by over 80% and has no mentions of the events in Gaza. The report on Hungary does not include the crackdown of LGBTQ plus people in the nation. Those are two pieces of news which Dr. Javadan thought were important and is more than happy to come and speak about them in future episodes. But for now, enjoy this one. Thank you. Let's go then. Boys, girls, and MBs, welcome back to the Smooth Brain Society. Today, we'll be talking to Dr. Pantea Javidan, who is a JD and PhD, so basically a double doctor from Stanford University. She is a member of the Human Rights in Trauma and Mental Health program there. So that's a combination of the work done by Stanford University's Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and their Center for Human Rights and International Justice. So Dr. Javidan has a unique sort of interdisciplinary expertise, which spans both sociology, law, and trauma and mental health, with a focus on systemic challenges and inequalities faced by marginalized communities. Her research is rooted in social inequalities, human trafficking, and the evolving complexities of migration and current refugee crises around the world. So thank you so much for coming on, Pantea. Welcome to the Smooth Brain Society.
Thank you for having me.
And for those who are new to the show, we always have a co-host on. Today, we have Sabrina Page on. I'll let Sabrina talk to you a little bit about her work and her expertise.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Sahir, for having me on today as well. My name is Sabrina. I'm a third-year PhD candidate at the University of Edinburgh, and my focus is on the mental health harms of children who have experienced technology-facilitated child sexual exploitation and abuse. My work has been in GBV, or gender-based violence, for the past 7 years. I've been a researcher primarily, and I originally started out focusing on intimate partner violence and food insecurity and the intersections there, especially in humanitarian settings, and then went on to child protection research. I am also the founder of the Gender Violence Research and Collaboration Network, which is a global network, grassroots feminist-led organization that supports the next generation of researchers and practitioners in the field of gender and violence. We have over 10,000 members now from more than 80 different countries. I'm also a consultant at various organizations and a global data fellow at Childlight. Thank you again, Sahir.
No, that's That's awesome. I am really glad to have you on because both of you, I guess, di- different and similar are experts or work in the field of gender-based violence, human rights, and that's something which I do not work in at all. So I'm coming from this from a novice angle. So apologies for naive questions, um, and then hopefully Sabrina can help carry the conversation along if I get bogged down in certain things which are completely unnecessary and irrelevant. Um, so let's get started then. Pantea, question for you, I guess. So you have a degree in law, a PhD as well. Could you give us a little bit of a background into how you sort of got into the field of research which you do, and sort of a little bit of a journey, sort of your journey into the space.
Yeah, thank you. I think the origin story for my both legal and my PhD work goes back to what I was doing after my undergraduate experience in sociology. I really started to become interested in the sociology of youth cultures towards the end of my degree, and I remember being really happy about the level of theoretical analysis that we were doing at Berkeley and just very interested in social theory. But I also really wanted to put those things into practice. And so I decided to become a mental health counselor between undergraduate and law school for about a year and a half. And so I started to work with at risk youth who were in and out of the criminal justice system. And so I worked as a residential counselor in a group home. And I started noticing patterns among the different kids that I was working with. So kids between the ages of 12 to 18 who were at risk of incarceration. And the pattern of abuse that I noticed was a lot of sexual and gender based violence in their lives. And then also the racialized nature of these patterns. And so mostly youth of color from the Bayview Hunters Point neighborhoods in San Francisco. And so I just became very enmeshed in their family lives and in their residential group home lives. And it's kind of rare for those of us who are attending an elite university to be asked for help in the field. And I just always it stuck with me when the girls that I would work with would tell me, Pantea, when you go to law school, come back and help us. So it just felt like this kind of life mission to make sure that their stories are told, to make sure that I try to understand why they ended up in the situations that they did and how their suffering became pathologized instead of helped by the system. So I really became interested in trying to understand the systemic failures that led them to leave these lives that were not random at all, very patterned. So that's how I came to the topic of the commercial sexual exploitation of children and just human trafficking in general. I started to really, once I decided to go back for my PhD after practicing law for 5 years, I decided to drill down more into the systemic issues and to look at structural inequities and justice.
So no, that's really cool. Can I ask? Because you said that you mentioned sort of like pattern systems which you saw which were being pathologized. So what sort of patterns were these? Yeah, for someone who wouldn't know.
In every case, it was always similar to the things that I've actually written about now about commercial sexual exploitation of children, that it typically begins with abandonment, with abuse, neglect, and then, there are always predators in the community who are ready to exploit that. And they're very good at picking up on vulnerable children and runaways and throwaways and putting them in that pipeline into the sex industry. And so that was the main pattern that I picked up on as a counselor. But then what I ended up doing was in law school, I looked into the legal structure of how it is that the children are actually being criminalized. So they are, in many ways, the perfect victim. They're children. They're exploited. They come from poor backgrounds, disadvantaged communities, economically marginalized, and so on and so forth. But they end up being criminalized, and traffickers most of the time end up getting away with these crimes. So, I wanted to understand that better. So I started looking at the structure of criminal laws and how we have contradictions in the laws. Like, we have statutory rape laws on the books, but as soon as there's a commercial transaction, as soon as there's money involved, criminality is then imputed on the child. And so there's this kind of implicit understanding that, well, they formed some kind of commercial contract, commercial sexual contract to do this. And that's criminal, and that they should be prosecuted for that. But then we have these child protective laws that don't kick in for most children of color. So those were the kinds of things that I wanted to really understand better. And so that's how I understood that it's actually a systemic problem, and that it is very much embedded in the same racial and class hierarchies that we're familiar with in other areas, but less familiar when it comes to this specific context. So once I went to pursue my PhD and to go deeper into this, I started looking at the history of child sex trafficking laws in the US. And it became clear to me how integral all of it actually is to the history of chattel slavery in the US, to the history of the ways that indigenous children were kidnapped and put in boarding schools and sexually abused in those contexts, and how intentional it actually all was too. And the ways that those laws started to change around the time of industrialization in the US and greater migration from Europe into American urban cities. And so just really wanted to better understand it in this historical context. And so the conclusion that I keep coming back to is also part of the story of capitalism, which is that we're often reduced to this human disposability under this system that is primarily interested in extracting labor and sexual service at the cheapest possible price point. And so that's kind of been an overarching theme of the research that I've done in this area.
I am very surprised that, like you mentioned, the statutory laws, and how that sort of contradicts with all of a sudden, uh, or what a moment like money is involved. Like, surely, if you're underage, the money should not make a difference at that point, because then it's still like your decision making is still not there, right? Like, uh, I know, because I know there's laws around work for people underage anyway. People under the age of 16 and 18, there's different laws for working other jobs. So I would have seen that those sort of would apply here in any way. Does that just not happen?
Right. So children under age of majority cannot form contracts under the law. They lack legal capacity to engage in labor or commerce, nor can they legally consent to sex under age of majority, defined by age of consent and statutory rape laws. And yet, when there's a commercial sex transaction involving a child, the law effectively imputes consent on the child in the most extreme way possible by criminalizing them for prostitution. This was the fundamental contradiction that blew me away as someone trained to think in law school that the law is logical, well-reasoned, and coherent. Thankfully, I had the guidance of critical legal theorists and a premier child rights expert, Maria Gran-Farley, who is actually one of the drafters of the UNCRC, to point the contradictions out and encourage me to apply my sociological mind to them. And these contradictions aren't unfortunate accidents that have simply gone unnoticed by lawmakers who are otherwise keen to resolve them and, protect all children equally. They are intentional, predictable, and known outcomes of a legal system that's structured by and reproduces socioeconomic inequalities. It's politics at play here and social hierarchy embedded in our legal structures. So that comes to the sociology side of what I do. When I looked back on how these laws actually came about at the origins of age of consent and statutory rape laws during the Gilded Age and Progressive era, it became clear that racism, sexism, and classism shaped the laws from the beginning, especially when I focused on who resisted these laws and why. It turned out even though women of all racial groups were organizing to raise age of consent, white women overtook and pushed women of color out of the reform movement. They didn't share women of color's concerns for protecting children of color from sexual exploitation, just like they didn't share their concern for protecting men of color from lynching, which was often based on false rape allegations and was terrorizing Black communities all over the country at the time. So the reform movement excluded people of color and instead focused on preserving white feminine chastity and sexual purity in order to gain the support of Southern white lawmakers who were generally hostile to the idea that girls could be sexually victimized by older men. And they made sure to invoke their ideas of working class girls and girls of color as antithetical to white sexual purity, as inherently promiscuous and immoral, and therefore they can't be victims of rape. They're always sexually consenting. So we had state lawmakers across the U.S. claiming that males and females were equally culpable for sex crimes because they're both capable of being lustful and immoral, in order to make sexual violence about the character of the parties involved, which is very much contingent on one's socioeconomic status. And Southern legislators in particular expressed outrage that age of consent laws would dare to treat Black and white girls equally because that goes against the laws of nature, they would argue. And they characterized girls of color as inherently hypersexual and white girls as sexually passive. So they argued that, all that this would accomplish, all that, age of consent and statutory rape laws do is just to set up upstanding white men for false rape allegations, for blackmail and extortion by girls, especially girls of color and especially those in prostitution. So there's this horrible quote that illustrates this from Representative A.C. Tompkins of Owensboro, Kentucky in 1895. He says, "We see at once what a terrible weapon for evil the elevating of the age of consent would be when placed in the hands of a lecherous, sensual Negro woman who, for the sake of blackmail or revenge, would not hesitate to bring criminal action even though she had been a prostitute since her 11th year. Anyone acquainted with the American Negro, a semi-civilized savage, will understand at once what bearing this has on the question without further enlightenment on my part." So this is how children of color are excluded from the very idea that they could ever be victims of sexual violence. And even though age of consent was raised anyways, the racism, sexism, and classism that excluded girls of color became incorporated into the laws through the creation of such things as the promiscuity defense or the chastity requirement, which girls of color were automatically excluded from, and which allowed perpetrators to avoid culpability by claiming that the girl in question is of bad character and therefore cannot be a victim. And that's how feminist solidarity and universalism around child protection from sexual exploitation was broken. And we get the contradiction between minors in prostitution being treated as consenting offenders and as non-consenting victims at the same time. And then the White Slave Traffic Act, or known as the Mann Act, was passed in 1910, making it even more explicit that sex trafficking laws are here to protect white females. And in fact, the origins of the FBI, which was established in 1908 as the Bureau of Investigation to enforce federal laws during the westward expansion of the U.S., was to enforce white slavery law and to prevent interracial sexual relations in marriages.
I did not know those were the origins of the FBI, or one of the origins of the FBI. Um, so with all that, so that's the history in the US. I know you focus there, but are is that similar across the world as well, or does this sort of influence how we look at, say, sex trafficking across borders, for example?
Yeah, actually, at the development of white slave traffic laws, this was a UK US endeavor, and they did actually have very similar origins. What's really interesting to me is that when the movement started in the UK, that there was actually a lot of support for the protection of young girls. It was enraging to the working classes and just to average folks. It wasn't just something that was led by a group of women or feminist advocates. It had really broad based support, and I think that's super interesting now too, because there is actually broad based support for actions against pedophiles and pedophilic rings. And we see that with the Jeffrey Epstein case right now, that there is certainly broad political support for bringing that case to light. And so it's something that really has historically galvanized a broad base of people. We have consensus that the sexual exploitation of children is wrong. But it just like with all other big issues and things that the elite are involved in, oftentimes it becomes politicized and propagandized. And then there's a divide and conquer kind of mentality, like, well, we're really just trying to protect, those innocent suburban kids, not those, more city savvy kids who rob their clients and things like that. So there's all these kinds of narratives at play that categorize children differently and turn some of them into delinquent types and others into ideal victim types.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned Jeffrey Epstein. That seems to be, I guess, the big talking point as it stands. Um, and you sort of see a lot of protection around it as well. Uh, is Does that sort of come about in other, I guess, sex trafficking rings? Because I clearly Jeffrey Epstein wasn't the only one, right? Otherwise there would not be an entire field of research around it, which you're part of. Um, and is the approach different if it's more high profile versus less high profile people, or does it feel like roughly the same to protect sort of these organizations which do it?
The rates of prosecution of traffickers is so remarkably low, and it follows the same pattern as perpetrators of sexual and gender based violence. Um, and so that's something that is consistent, that when it comes to sex crimes in general, whether they're commercial sex crimes or violent sex crimes, that the rate of prosecution is quite low. We're talking around the 2% range for traffickers and for rapists in many jurisdictions. Whereas with, for example, a child that's charged with prostitution, if they are charged with prostitution, which is actually the case in many cases, instead of being classified as victims of sex trafficking, that they are very harshly punished. And I actually have a law review article about that's comparing the case of Jeffrey Epstein to the case of a sex trafficking survivor, Centoya Brown, who was abused as a child. She was trafficked as a child. She ended up killing a a pedophile who had hired her for the night, and she thought that he was going to kill her, so she killed him first, and received 51-year sentence for that as a teenager, as a 16-year-old. And I compared her case to the way that Jeffrey Epstein was treated, somebody who's been accused of potentially trafficking 1,000 or so girls throughout several decades. And the ways that the legal system dealt with these two cases is so telling about how the criminal justice system views perpetrators and victims, regardless of the power dynamics, regardless of the structural inequities involved, the disadvantages and major advantages. And we see this over and over again in different kinds of sex trafficking rings that the elite are involved in, or even just organized criminals who are able to enjoy impunity for these crimes, whereas the victims are oftentimes the criminalized and incarcerated.
I'm just wondering, because you talked about how it's viewed kind of in the legal space, but what are the broader societal implications of cases like Jeffrey Epstein? Because, you know, how media and political narratives shape public perception now of child trafficking based on what they're being shown online or through the media. I think that's a very interesting kind of lens to look through.
I feel that the Jeffrey Epstein case and similar cases are really emblematic of elite impunity in the first place, of how the system supports people who have these kinds of moneyed connections. And, you know, the case is so sprawling, it's really quite shocking. And I don't blame anyone for being very interested in where it actually goes and what comes to light. And we're very much in the thick of it politically at the moment. But I think that it's really critical to understand societal dynamics and structural inequities through the lens of a case like this, because it really does touch upon every different aspect of the structural injustices that we're dealing with. And so I think about the fact that, you know, very high profile lawyers, academics, politicians, media personalities, you know, CEOs, and all of these different men who are involved, and the, you know, female collaborators, of course, like Ghislaine Maxwell, and the different roles that they played, and how for so long they got away with these crimes. And especially in the research that I did, one of the most shocking aspects of the case was the way that the criminal justice system was manipulated, both on the state and federal level in the US. And they talk about, you know, this sweetheart deal that Jeffrey Epstein received in Florida. And when I looked at how they did that, it was like they treated it as a contractual negotiation, as if you're, you know, buying a jet or something like that. You know, he would actually get documents from the opposing side that he was able to revise and edit to his own terms. It's just something that's really quite an anomaly, I would like to think, but it's just not how the criminal justice system is supposed to ever work. But it was very much as if it was some kind of civil case and contractual issue to negotiate the terms of his criminal punishment. And of course, he served 13 months, I think, in a state jail where he had 10-hour breaks from, and, you know, he luxuriated in that jail cell that he hardly spent much time in. He really just slept there. And so one wonders, and they're really looking at, you know, I think all of this actually began with a female journalist who was looking into how a math teacher, a high school math teacher, managed to become a multimillionaire of that caliber, to own an island and the largest mansion in Manhattan. And then all of this came to light as a result of looking into that case. And of course, the other very shocking aspect to me is that how much violence actually went into maintaining this, running people off the road, threatening them, with death threats, including the journalists, and just the remarkable level of activism by female journalists, especially by lawyers, that it took and how long it took to actually bring the case to light and to reopen it.
I think less of a question, more of just a comment, is something about this case that infuriates me as an academic really studying this, is the way that media is using this kind of as like a political bait, especially as we see with, the current situation with trying to release the files in the US or, to prove that Donald Trump was involved. And it's like, okay, well, we need to start channeling our energy to understand actually the victims that have been affected, what trafficking is, how the legal system has failed a lot of victims, and I struggle outside of work to really focus on that case in particular because it just really makes my blood boil. Sorry, go ahead, Sahir.
No, I think that's absolutely how I feel too, because one of the historical patterns I've also noticed is the ways in which, because of the importance and gravity of this problem, and, like I said, that there's very broad-based consensus that pedophilia and commercial sexual exploitation of children is wrong and reprehensible, and we have all kinds of criminal laws against it. But it actually, because of that power that it has, the morality that it has, that it's then exploited oftentimes as a political issue, and so it can actually be very galvanizing politically, and that's why I think also that evangelicals in the U.S. and religious organizations really latch on to this issue because they can really use the moral gravity of it, and whoever kind of owns the issue can really also exploited in those ways. And I've seen that historically being done, that it's almost as if the core issue is just completely lost and it just becomes this political football in many ways. And then, of course, the deflections like, oh, it's the Democrats that are doing it, or no, it's really MAGA that was involved. And it's like, that's not really what's key here. The fact that this ever happened should give us so much pause about the system in which we live.
So true. I literally just saw a video posted online on social media of Donald Trump saying, yeah, well, Bill Clinton went 28 times to that island. I never. And I'm like, you are missing the whole point here. You are placing the blame on everyone but the system itself, in which you're sitting in a powerful position to change. And yeah.
Anyway. Yes, exactly. I mean, and when you look into that case, you see how it was so much about political favoritism and just doing each other favors. I mean, that's kind of the origins of trafficking, of the traffic in women, is, I think Gail Rubin actually talked about this in her seminal piece about how women were traded essentially among tribes as, kind of power brokering. And that persists to this day. These are men who are bonding over the sexual abuse of girls' bodies and trading them like commodities and having a whole, racket and ring around it. And there's, all kinds of motivations that are also exposed behind this, like pyramid schemes of blackmail and so on and so forth. So it's really imbibed with sort of every aspect of corruption in our societies, and all of these issues around capitalism and disposability and the racial and gender hierarchies of that.
I'm still on the thing that with how big the entire case was, how many people were trafficked, and the only people punished, if any punishment, were literally Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, right? Like Prince Andrew's name came in it, nothing's really happened to him. All these other names keep popping up, but nobody's actually faced any consequences at all. So it comes back to your 2% statistic of where 2% of what was the actual statistic? Just to be correct, it was 2% of people involved in sex trafficking
In
get.
many cases, in many jurisdictions, I found that really only around 2%, sometimes even less,
Yeah.
of traffickers are actually prosecuted,
So,
and similar to perpetrators of rape and sexual violence.
so yeah, so it speaks to that sort of thing, that how can such a big case happen with so many names, high profile names allegedly, and almost no one gets
Yeah.
any sort of, yeah,
And
punishment.
imagine that, that high profile case, because, a lot of the victims were white and it was in the US and it's the global north, and that's who's in the media, and that's what's being talked about, and that's who's been prosecuted, not to their full extent, but to the extent that they, believed they were doing correct. And you just imagine all the other cases out in the world like this going
Exactly,
on in the
yeah.
global south, their
Which,
indigenous communities. And if they only got, two of them got prosecuted, imagine what's happening beyond that,
Yes. Exactly. I tend to see this issue as much bigger than it's made to be. I think that it's actually a lot more pervasive. And one of the things, if I may bring it up, is that as an academic, I mean, you've probably run into similar issues, Sabrina, where it's very frustrating. To see the argument, I would call it maybe the feminist libertarian argument. I wouldn't call it a feminist argument personally, but the libertarian argument that spends all of its energy actually justifying the sex industry, and even the commercial sexual exploitation of children. So the main bugaboo, I guess you could say, that I've ran into in doing this research is that it's actually, you would think that because we do have broad consensus societally that this is wrong, that this shouldn't happen, that, we could all agree on that and work towards ending it. But really, what we're running into is this paradigm that actually pushes back against that with things like, well, 16 and 17-year-olds are essentially adults anyway. Most children in prostitution are 16 and 17. So, they can really consent. And they're just, it's survival sex. They're, street entrepreneurs. And this kind of libertarian ideology about bootstrapping and, that you get called a prude or sex negative for making these arguments on behalf of the protection of children. When what I've really found is that the age of entry, the average age of entry into child prostitution is about 12 to 13 years old. And again, we have laws on the books that say that you can't consent to sex at that age. And yet, when it's commercial sex, it's criminalized and the responsibility is imputed on the child. And the legal system largely agrees with that, despite, having more progressive laws on the books now that protect trafficking victims. They continue to be criminalized in practice. So they will interface with the carceral system. Um, Even just the act of arrest, actually, in the US context in particular, puts you on the criminal track rather than the victim protection track. So I think these are really important issues to sift through. It's complicated only because of this kind of paradigm that is actually very entrenched in academia.
I wanted to take like a little step forward from what we were talking about. Just to ask you a little bit more about more human rights of underage uh people. So like children, like the human rights of children. Because of how we were talking about this, we mentioned it in sex work, but we also mentioned it in regular work and laws around it and their interactions with the justice system. How are human rights of children different from just overall human rights, or how we look at them as a researcher? Could you tell me?
So, children, we have the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the guiding document, and it has a really amazing history. It's the most ratified treaty in human history. So, again, broad based consensus throughout the world and across cultures for the protection of children. And, it recognizes children's developing and evolving capacities, that there's different stages of child development. So, 10-year-old's not the same as a 17-year-old, but it does recognize all of those nuances. And so I think it's a really important historical marker. That treaty, the convention, was adopted in 1989. And the only country that's actually never ratified it is the United States to this day. So the US is very much an outlier when it comes to children's rights, at least in the human rights context. And I can get into the history of why that is, which is also really very interesting. But the fact that we do have global consensus on children's rights is really something that makes children's rights stand out in the human rights context. But of course, all of the other human rights treaties also apply to children. Um, should I get into some of the history of why the
Yes,
US?
yes, please, because I know that they do not. So I had a international human rights lawyer on 2 years ago now, and he said that the U.S. had not signed on to the Geneva Conventions, which is the convention for sort of war crimes and genocide. So USA had not signed on to that. So I'm guessing that historically the U.S. just does not sign on to international treaties.
It's unfortunately oftentimes the case that the US is an outlier in the human rights context. I mean, we've had decades of going from multilateralism to bilateralism to unilateralism with the war on terror, and now very much um, almost a rogue state when it comes to this, as we can see now with the genocide in Gaza and how the US and Israel tend to stand alone and to block any kind of ceasefire or real meaningful progress towards ending that catastrophe. And so, yeah, unfortunately, even when it comes to children's rights, it's very interesting because the US actually historically is a leader on children's rights. But when it came to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, it became the outlier in rejecting it. There's this very rich history of actually around child labor laws in the US and pushing back against child labor, where a lot of this originates. And it began, as early as the 1830s in the antebellum period, and went forward, and by the turn of the last century gained the most traction. And we have, modern child labor laws on the books, which are now actually being rolled back again. And so, which is a very disturbing new development. But it was really the Christian right that was behind opposing the adoption of the UNCRC, um, mainly on the grounds of the same arguments they make now about trans kids' rights, which is that it's an issue of parental rights. So they create this binary of children's rights versus parents' rights, and really harped on this fact of, well, if we give children their rights, then parents will lose their rights, as if it's some kind of hydraulic process, but really they're meant to be integral. It's meant to empower parents and children. And so there's a whole kind of history about these Christian based arguments and traditionalist arguments about family structure that went into opposing children's rights.
But you say that, but I guess if there's 206, or I don't know how many UN member states there are, 190 something. I would say a lot of them are Christian majority states, which would have signed on to it anyway. So the Christianity argument falls apart very quickly, at least the way I look at it. Uh,
Sure, of course, on its merits. But I
yeah.
think this all comes down to political power, and the evangelical bloc is very powerful in the US. And that's actually been the major pushback against civil rights in the US. So the civil rights backlash actually in the 19 after the 1960s civil rights movement was led by the Christian right. And so that same block is largely behind, the anti-feminist backlash, civil rights backlash, going against affirmative action and, against indigenous rights and all of the different activist movements of the 1960s, the post-war era.
Mm. That's incredibly interesting. Um, I wanted to talk a bit further about this in regards to your work in this area. So, what is your specific research with regards to children's, yeah, human rights? You had said that you had published a couple papers recently on it as well. And yeah, so if you could go into that, and then we'll talk about that.
Yeah, most recently, I have actually focused a lot on pandemic policy since COVID-19 and the ways that schools were not adequately mitigated for the pandemic, and children's rights were really trampled upon throughout the pandemic. And I also one of the main projects and themes of the Human Rights and Trauma Mental Health Lab that I'm part of is to integrate trauma informed principles into justice systems and protocols. And so we're very much focused on women and children in that. So, we're working with the International Criminal Court and the UN system to try and incorporate trauma informed principles. So these are different ways of implementing children's rights that are practical, and I think I would emphasize the the pandemic policy aspect because that's something that we globally are forgetting the lessons of, and it's so important with looming pandemics. We have a looming H5 pandemic, and we're just so incredibly ill, not just ill prepared, but actually from the pandemic we now have a major pillar of neo-fascism on our hands, which is the anti-science movement. They very successfully propagandized the pandemic and denied the harms of COVID and long COVID. And they denied harms to children throughout the entire pandemic to this very day. They have not upgraded schools. They have not cleaned the air in schools. We have so many amazing tools and technologies now to deal with these things, but we just don't do it because we are very much in a moment of actually trampling children's rights, I think.
So, very quickly, could you give me an example of how the rights are trampled in schools? Like, I'm trying to, because I feel I know I wasn't in school during the pandemic, fortunately enough. So I'm thinking of like, weren't everyone's, I guess, like rights? I mean, for the public good, but like, were rights kind of trampled on, being like, oh, you need to get the vaccine, or you can't go here if you don't have this, blah blah blah. Which I mean, they already do anyway. Like, you can't enter a school without being vaccinated, for example, in most countries around the world and things like that. But I mean, people made a big fuss about it, but I felt that everybody sort of was in the same boat of things, where this thing specific to children.
So the one of the first kind of anchoring points that came out at the beginning of the pandemic was that COVID doesn't affect children. That for some reason children are not either getting COVID or, for example, Dr. Monica Gandhi at UCSF was a really prominent voice during the pandemic and including in the early days. And she said that children do not get severe disease. Absolutely untrue. So, this anchoring bias took place from the very beginning that children are somehow not that affected by this. And so, we don't really need to do much to protect them. We did close schools in most places, rightfully, I think. And But then didn't really have much of a plan, and many of the private schools actually led the way, the right way, scientific approach to because COVID is an airborne infectious disease, and so it lingers in the air for hours. You can just walk in a hallway and get it after someone's left a long time. So we knew these kinds of things. Those were emerging early on. And many of the private schools took the initiative to clean the air, put purifiers in, have masks that work well, and all kinds of, and PCR testing twice a week, those kinds of things. We saw that in the Bay Area. And so there was a way to actually deal with this until vaccines came along, and even afterwards, because the vaccines did not protect from infection, and they're very limited in protecting against long COVID, which is the long-term sequelae of COVID. And so, and that's actually the more dangerous aspect of it, because most people survive the acute phase after vaccination, but long COVID is not so well protected against with the vaccines. There's actually between a 20 to 50% chance of developing long COVID with each COVID infection, regardless of vaccine status. And so from the very beginning, children's health was deprioritized. They were somehow seen as either immune from this problem. It was mainly a problem of the elderly, of the frail, and so we kind of heard these sorts of narratives, and now it's coming out. Many of us have been saying this for years, that that's not true, that we have pediatric long COVID. It's actually quite prevalent. It's affecting around 20% of the cases. And so kids are getting COVID between once to 3 times a year if they're totally unprotected. And so their chances of developing this long-term health condition is really quite high, clinically speaking. And so in that sense, I think that, this sort of mass forgetting and this really broad-based buy-in into the fact that, well, this is somehow behind us. It's no longer an issue. We're vaxxed and relaxed. It's actually not true at all. And so that's one of the things that I think just does not get discussed anywhere near enough. And we're, working on pandemic accords and things like that, but we have this massive anti-science movement that actually used this moment to rise up. And, we have anti-vaxxers now who are running the FDA and the HHS in the US.
Can I just say as well, it was very interesting. I talked about how private schools have really led, a good initiative into this, because I think this really takes us back to the beginning of our conversation. We were talking about the economic disadvantages between different social classes. And, for example, with the Epstein case, this is getting so much attention because these people are famous, and it was, the rich, the high profile people are involved. Other cases just get fallen behind. I mean, this is kind of a similar case scenario as well, right, with the whole COVID pandemic and how we're protecting children from that. Okay, well, those who can afford to go to elite schools are getting that better public health protection. Well, what about, if we look at that a bit more microscopically, what about those in other social classes, and how does that intersect with their human rights in other areas? Because we see that a lot in research with the tech side of things, technology facilitated abuse, and how it disproportionately affects those in lower socioeconomic status classes, and still trying to figure out all of the reasons why that is. But we have a good idea of the initial reason being that wealth and power doesn't sit within that class, therefore it doesn't get that attention. So I don't know, I just more so of a comment, but I just thought that was really interesting, the intersection there.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in the US context especially, there was actually very adequate money allocated to mitigating the pandemic in schools. But we saw actually with the summer of 2020 and the movement for Black Lives during that time, that instead of responding to the public outcry for defunding the police and for putting that money into communities, the COVID money actually largely went to the police in many jurisdictions. And so it got funneled into precisely a crackdown on the communities that you're talking about, on the more vulnerable communities that were hit the hardest by the pandemic and continue to be. So we can see this kind of very sinister process of actually putting the resources that are being demanded into the opposite side that actually makes communities more vulnerable. And what's really interesting is that, we are still dealing with the fallout of all of that, of and I wrote an entire paper about this too, called The Struggle to Breathe, because we were dealing that summer of 2020 with raging wildfires in California that choked us for 9 weeks straight. And we woke up to a sky that was bright red one morning and stayed that way all day. At the same time, we were seeing images of George Floyd being strangled to death. And we were also dealing with an airborne virus that was killing people. And we were also in the midst of the first Trump regime. And so it just seemed like the running theme through all of that was the struggle to breathe. And I think that that really brought the moment together for me. And we're still now seeing the ramifications of all of those things, the climate impacts, police brutality, and the role that it plays in neo-fascist regimes, and just the anti-science and lack of pandemic preparedness as we go into greater moments of climate catastrophe, which will actually create more zoonosis and pandemics. So I think it's really important for us to keep contending with all of those issues. And um, because the younger generation is also um, a lot more informed about all of these things, but their will is not being implemented. We're not seeing it reflected in mainstream politics. I think it's very important for us to focus on the rights of children and youth. The key to children's rights is always to utilize them in ways that benefit children, and that needs to be demonstrated empirically. So, the best interests of the child is the guiding principle of the UNCRC and children's rights writ large. So, there's differences in the argument between, children's rights to education, health and safety, versus children's quote unquote rights to, for example, smoke and vape or to sell sex, which is a libertarian argument that's made to sound like children's rights. But these are not equivalent positions. They're not equally legitimate, because the empirical case cannot be made that smoking and selling sex are beneficial to children individually or collectively as a class. And again, we have robust international metrics that define child welfare and its determinants. So the best interests of the child is empirically verifiable.
Speaking of rights of children and youth, and like their voices not being heard, in the UK very recently, a bill was passed to change the voting age to 16. That's correct, isn't it, Sabrina? I'm getting that
Yeah.
right. What are your thoughts on that as like a thing, reducing the voting age in the US as well? Or
I think it's great. I think it's actually a really positive thing. I think the more the younger people can have their voices heard and counted, I don't honestly know how much election integrity we're going to have going forward in the US at this point. I'm not optimistic about the political apparatus. But, certainly, at least even that official recognition would be a major empowerment for younger people to have a voice. Perhaps, they can at least be effective on local levels in the electoral system and organizing.
I quite like it here because I think at 16 you can work here. So if you're working and paying in, then you should have your say. And I feel in the US you can't. You can work at 16 in some states even younger, but you can't drink until 21, and but you can join the military at 18. And I feel like it's all very weird.
Yeah, it's what the US calls taxation without representation, and they're just doing it to their children.
So I want to like because I guess last time 15 odd minutes, I want to like think of more positive things or in positive lights. What sort of steps do you think we need to take moving forward, or what sort of things do you think we can do moving forward in terms of let's start with first with where we started off with sort of the sex trafficking and sort of gender-based violence sort of first. What do you reckon we can do moving forward to sort of improve the current situation, improve the sort of criminality rates, protect victims, and yeah, so on.
I think certainly the reallocation of resources in a way that is just, that is a just distribution of resources, is where we always begin. In the US, children receive a third of the resources that the elderly do in terms of structural supports. And again, this is all changing for the worst. It's because of the political power and the economic power of elders that they have this kind of influence and power. But children are on the opposite end of the spectrum there, and the US again is an outlier in that, and so they fare worse than other OECD nations. I think the US and UK are and Mexico are more on par in terms of the different measures of the international measures of child welfare. And so I think those are the areas that one can focus on, improving those metrics. I mean, we actually don't need to ever reinvent the wheel. We have really good metrics. We have great SDGs and all of these kinds of things that we can focus on. So we certainly have the roadmaps, and it always comes down to political will and the allocation of resources towards these things. So it's actually not terribly complicated. It's a political matter.
Can I build off that question that Sahir asked as well about, and taking this from like a more academic lens? But I wrote earlier, as we were talking about feminist and libertarian like research, and how with sex trafficking and thinking about sex positivity and how those two kind of collide. But I'm wondering, how can feminist research contribute to transformative justice approaches?
Feminist research can and should contribute to all systems, social, economic, legal, and political, to correct the structural sexism that's embedded in each of them and the persistence of gender inequalities in each of these areas. So, for example, abolitionist feminism is leading the charge against carceral and punitive responses to socioeconomic problems, and that's a really important and new intervention in justice systems and transformative justice. And I think also that we should reconnect women's and children's rights. During first wave feminism at the turn of the last century and going into the progressive era, the two sets of rights were very much bound together, but it was under a traditionalist approach to women having to be the primary caregivers of their children, not as equal partners with their husbands, presumed husbands. And somewhere in second wave feminism, the two sets of rights were severed from one another, largely because women were resisting their role under a patriarchal model of having to be the primary caregivers to their children. But I think it's really important to reconnect these two sets of rights, because the fates of women and children are actually bound together in reality still. And we see this, for example, in the genocide in Gaza, how women and children are disproportionately impacted through deaths and injuries. And in the human trafficking context, where the disproportionate victims of human trafficking, particularly sex trafficking, are women and children. And we see how important social welfare programs are to covering both women and children. One of the practical ways that I'm seeing is the way that trauma-informed approaches for mental health, as we're integrating them more into justice systems, international justice systems, that's definitely a point of intervention for feminists. Just this idea of not re-traumatizing survivors of sexual violence is so critical. This is one of the biggest issues in criminal justice, I think, historically. And we're really now finally dealing with that head on, that you don't, for example, interview a survivor 10 times for a case. You're continually re-traumatizing them. So there's these kinds of solutions that are being implemented into these systems now to prevent that re-traumatization. So I think that is one of the practical ways, and that needs to become more widespread and understood. And sorry, did you ask a different question too?
No, 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 that's perfect. Yeah, thank you.
Just on the re-traumatizing people bit, what can you say to? I know this is sometimes used as a defense to keep things under the rug, right? Being like, "Oh, we don't want to re-traumatize victims, so we therefore should not reopen these cases," or they use them as so. Sometimes, like I hear people sort of hiding behind the victim, sort of re-traumatizing them to like keep things under the rug. Does that sort of clash in sort of a trauma informed approach or in sort of how we deal with these things moving forward?
Right. So the idea isn't to not deal with the case in
Yeah,
order
yeah,
not
yeah.
to re traumatize the survivor, but rather once you can gain the trust of a survivor to give their testimony and to want to pursue justice, that you then make sure that throughout that process they're not re traumatized so that they can give their testimony one time, for example, and maybe it's recorded or it's done in a certain way that prevents having to discuss things that they're not comfortable discussing or they're not ready to yet. And so it's we actually have entire manuals devoted to how to do these things, so it can get quite technical, but those are kind of the real practical implications of taking into account the way that women and girls have been deterred, and even boys and men who are survivors have been deterred from actually pursuing justice because of how re-traumatizing the actual process is. The kind of scrutiny that they receive, the kind of badgering they might get as a witness, and these sorts of things. So those are the kind of aspects that we're trying to correct with trauma-informed approaches.
No, yet. So I'm also quite interested in sort of the legislative side of it because you had said that you were approaching the United Nations and talking to the ICJ, so the International Court of Justice, and all about sort of ratifying or bringing about trauma informed approaches into systems more broadly. How does that work on like a larger level, on a smaller level? Like when we're talking, we can say it's good if we do this and do that, do this, but how does it actually come about? How do we actually bring this change?
So there are communities of practice. There are many people who work with survivors, different NGOs and attorneys, and all over the world, really. And you know, we have like mental health experts at the ICC who are able to be in touch with all of these different stakeholders, and they get their like, for example, one of the recent reports that we published was done in this way. It was like an iterative process of talking to the people in the field who are actually hearing from survivors and providing services and connecting them with the services they need, and then incorporating that into a kind of a set of practices that can be embedded into justice systems. And so it's kind of, it's from the ground up. It's from talking to people who are in places like Ukraine or in different war zones and things in Africa and everywhere, really. And then taking that sort of what is effective in dealing with survivors and then incorporating that into a TI approach. And of course, you have to have insiders in those systems. So somebody who's, for example, the head of trauma informed approaches and mental health services and things like that at a tribunal like that can actually be, should be the person that makes those connections. And so there's kind of a whole process where you start with gathering this information and creating recommendations, and then trying to turn those into guidelines, and then something bigger that then becomes integral to the whole justice system of the UN, for example, and then hopefully gets adopted by national courts. There are some national courts that actually are really progressive in this area, so they can serve as models for how to do this.
Do you have an example of one national court which you think is pretty progressive in this area? Any
It's a good
country or
question.
anything?
Well, I would say like uh, different courts, like hybrid courts. I think, see, now I'm like blanking on names, but the Court of Sierra Leone and some of the other ones that we cite in the report serve as some good illustrative examples of how this was done. And so the ECCC in Cambodia also, from start to finish. But yeah, so these kinds of different courts have set examples of how to actually have more trauma informed practices from the beginning of when you actually, first, before the case even begins, and how you coach the witnesses and prepare them for the process and really educate them about what's going to happen so that it's predictable, all the way to actually once the case has ended and how you sort of like debrief and the kind of services you connect them with afterwards. It's a really, long and kind of very involved process. That's why it's important to standardize trauma informed approaches as part of the international legal system and the human rights regime, because that will establish a universalism of this approach and best practices that is also culturally and contextually informed and adapted so that national courts can take this up.
I really can't see EU or the US or sort of any Western country taking its notes from Cambodia or Sierra Leone, to be honest.
We try.
Just by the just how the world works and what I've seen of it. But hopefully, fingers crossed. Um, because we've been recording for about an hour now, Sabrina, did you have any final questions for Pantea? I know there's a lot we can actually talk about, but there's
Oh yeah,
also
I think we could,
levels.
I think we could go on for hours really. But no, I just wanted to thank Pandia for all of her work and her contributions in this field. I've learned so much from you over just a short amount of time. So I really look forward to reading more of your work and staying in touch. Yeah.
Now, thank you so much, Pantea. I have one question which is not related to. I mean, it's kind of related because it's still child trafficking. But do you oh, when we talk about child sex trafficking, we usually talk about girls. I know boys as well, like you mentioned, but mainly girls. Do you know or do you have any research on children being trafficked? I know particularly in Africa to join militias and things like that, like boys being trafficked for that. Is there sort of a difference in how we look at sex trafficking versus, like trafficking for sort of being joined or into militias or groups or communities? Yeah, just
I
wondering.
think it has the same problem with child soldiering, where the
Yeah, child soldiers, that's the
boundaries
word.
between victim and perpetrator get blurred very much. And so I think it's maybe more stark in the child soldiering case because they actually do commit harms. They're trained and forced into committing harms against others. And so we certainly deal with that problem in that context too. And yes, there's many different forms of child trafficking. It's it's true that it's not just sexual or labor exploitation, because what is soldiering, it is certainly a form of labor in some ways, but it is violence, and there is actually a sexual aspect to it too, where girls who are in the child soldiering context are often sexually exploited, or even kind of sold, and
Yeah.
traded among others. And so yeah, I think there's a great deal of overlap between those issues.
No. Awesome. No, thank you. Just wanted to. That was the final question which popped up for now. I know we can talk about a lot more, but thank you so much for joining, Pantea.
Thank you. I really
Uh,
appreciate being with you both.
and I guess one last question which we ask all our guests is if you had any general piece of advice for our listeners, what would it be?
That's really hard.
It's the toughest question we ask, I have heard.
Yeah, it's that's profound. In this moment, because I feel that we are in, the moment of polycrisis in our world, and we certainly have a problem of authoritarianism in our world. Even the liberal democracies are largely disappearing. I think at last count, it was something like 11 to 13% of countries are even liberal democracies anymore. And so that whole prediction about the end of history by my colleague Fukuyama, was it, is not really coming true. We're actually in a really big moment of crisis. And I hope that despite how overwhelming and intractable it seems, that we can actually really focus on our work and be very intentional about it and keep pushing forward and taking the deep breaths and self-care and everything that we need, just everything that's so integral to us continuing to go forward. It's, I know, very hard to stay positive in this environment, but I think we don't have the luxury of giving up. So yeah, I just really appreciate all the people like yourself that are working hard to make things better. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sabrina, again for coming on. Thank you, Pantea. Special thanks to everybody who's listening, everybody who stayed till the end. Really appreciate it. So thank you so much, and see you all in the. Thank you so much, and see you all in the next episode. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.